one of the themes that runs throughout the AP Art History course is what happens when long-standing cultural traditions, and particularly artistic traditions of a group of people, collide with the changing modern world. And so this is one of those works that really helps us to see the resilience of artists who are able to meet that collision with grace and with creativity. So the work that we're looking at is called Black on Black Ceramic Vessel, and it was created in the middle of the 20th century in northern New Mexico by an artist whose name is Maria Martínez. Now, she's the potter, and then the person who decorated the pot is her husband, whose name was Julian Martínez. And so let's go back and let's set a little bit of historical context. I'm going to remind us that the people who live in northern New Mexico today are referred to as the Pueblo Indians, and that they are the descendants of the people who built Cliff Palace at Mesa Verde. Now remember that Mesa Verde had been abandoned by about 1300, but we can see on the walls of one of the rooms at Cliff Palace these bold geometric designs that suggest organic forms and the landscape around them. And so remember that we believe that the people of Mesa Verde made their way to northern New Mexico. Now, in northern New Mexico at the time was another group of ancestral Puebloans living at the site that is known as Bandolier. Now, it's been turned into a national monument that you can visit just like you can visit Mesa Verde, named Bandolier National Monument. And so the people were living at Bandolier at the same time that people were living at Mesa Verde. But they stayed at Bandelier up until the 1500s. In the 1500s, this is the point where they leave their cliffside dwellings and move to the pueblos that are located in the area around Taos and Santa Fe today. So by the time we get to the 1800s, there had been among the Pueblo peoples a 1,000-year tradition of making ceramics. And so by the time we get to the 1880s, there were people would make plain pots for very practical uses, such as cooking or for storing food or other goods. And then they would make beautifully decorated pots to use as serving dishes. So here is this long tradition artistically that was really central to the identity of the Pueblo peoples. Well, in the 1880s, something happens to make that tradition collide with the modern world. And what it is that causes that to happen is that the railroad is extended from the area around St. Louis down to Santa Fe. And when the trains come, they bring two things that are going to radically alter the artistic production that we see on the Pueblos. The first thing that they bring is inexpensive metal pots and pans. Well, when the locals at the Pueblos figure out that they can go down to the local trading post and they can buy these inexpensive metal pots and pans, then what's the point of continuing to make ceramic pots and pans? And so what we see happen at this point is that the production of these ceramic goods goes into a serious nosedive. The production just dwindles because there simply is not the demand for it among the Pueblo people. At the same time, however, the trains bring a second thing. And the second thing is tourists. In the same way that we talk about the impact of tourists coming onto the Wind River Reservation where the Shoshone lived, and Chief Washake and his son Cosico creating things to sell to them as a way of supplementing their income, then what is going to happen in northern New Mexico is that these tourists, same kind of curiosity, are going to come on to the Pueblos and they want to buy things. They want to buy souvenirs to take home with them. Well, at about this time, an archaeologist who was working at Bandelier named Edgar Lee Hewitt was one of the people who was very, very upset about the decline in the Pueblo ceramic production. And so he happened to be the employer of Julian Martínez. Julian was one of his assistants. And so they kept digging up these fragments of pots. And Julian told Edgar Lee Hewitt about his wife, Maria, this young woman who already, even though she was young, had this reputation among all of the people of the Pueblos as this amazing potter. And so what Edgar Lee Hewitt suggested was that Julian and Maria attempt to revive this ancient tradition of pot making as was being practiced back by the ancestral Puebloans. And so one particular kind of pottery shard that they dug up at Bandolier really caught the imagination of Maria the potter and Julian the pot painter. And those were these black shards of glossy black pottery that had dull or matte finish ornamentation that was on top of it. They had never seen anything like this. This had not been produced on the Pueblos for generations, as far as they knew. And so they decided that they were going to try to figure out how to do that. So they went to a clay mine that was in their locale where the clay had a very high iron content. And when fired, depending on the heat of the fire, that clay would turn different colors. And so they experimented and experimented and experimented. They ultimately came up with a 6-stage firing process, which resulted in the beautiful kind of pot that you see down here, which becomes this very distinctive style known as black on black that Maria Martínez is especially associated with. So let's talk about how exactly they produced this. Maria Martínez would get this clay with this high iron content. She never used a wheel. She always made her pots completely by hand. And so you can see in this photograph that she would take a shallow bowl and she would press clay down into the bowl to create a base. And so then she would roll the clay into these coils and then attach the coils around the base. And then gradually, coil by coil, she would build it up to the height that she wanted. And she would turn the bowl to keep it completely round. And she would have her fingers inside the bowl to shape it into a particular configuration as she brought it up in height, and so ended up by creating this very thin-walled pot. Now, once that clay was dry, once she had finished doing the pot, and she'd given the clay time to dry, she would come back with stones of different sorts of textures. And she would go from rougher texture down to very, very smooth textures. And she would rub the entire surface of the pot to make it as smooth as it possibly could get. Then once it had been sanded and smoothed, she painted the entire thing with this slip. Now, a slip is clay that is mixed with water. It's this watery mix of clay and water. And so she would paint the entire surface of the pot with that clay, and then they would fire it. Now, when that happened, the entire pot would come out, and she would bring out her polishing stone again, and she would polish. And what that would create is this glossy surface. Well, that's the point at which the pot decorator comes onto the scene. And so Julian was the decorator of her very earliest pots. What he did was he looked back to those pottery shards that they were digging up at Bandelier, and to pots from Mesa Verde, and from the ornamentation that we see on the walls here at Mesa Verde. And so he used those bold geometric ornaments that brought to mind organic things within the natural landscape. He used those as his inspiration in creating the designs that we see on these pots. And so he painted those on with a slip. And then they continued with this firing process until ultimately, in the very last stage, what they did was they smothered the fire to create all this smoke within the kiln, but they didn't open the kiln. And when they smothered the fire, that smoke turned both the slip that was the ornamentation and the pot itself black, resulting in this incredibly beautiful and distinctive black on black style. All right, so what I want to ask you to do first is I'd like you to pause, and I would like you please to write down what is the impact of the train coming to Santa Fe. Come back to me when you are finished with that. All right, so let's talk about once they've developed this beautiful pot, this technique for making these beautiful pots, how do the tourists enter into the picture? Well, what they begin to do is they begin to reframe Pueblo ceramic Pueblo ceramics such that they are no longer thought of as beautiful, useful objects, and instead they begin to market them as fine art. And so these tourists who come onto the Pueblos, they are introduced to these not as useful, pretty objects, but instead as collector's items. And so these people who are collectors recognize the beauty of these works, and they buy them, they take them home, and so gradually the fame of Maria Martínez begins to spread. That fame is going to spread even more because Maria and Julian are going to go out into the world and do demonstrations. They're going to go to the world's fairs and do demonstrations there, such that there becomes this real demand for black on black pottery from the Pueblo. And so it's not long before these collectors and these, especially art galleries, begin to encourage Maria Martínez to sign her name to the pots. And she's really, really reluctant to do this because even though they insist that what the impact of that will be that it will raise the value of the objects as collectors' items, and that they can charge more money for them as a result, she's really reluctant to do that because of the fact that pot making traditionally is a communal activity. It takes communal labor. There are the people who go out and discover the clay mines. There are the people who go out and actually mine the clay and bring it back to the Pueblo. There are the people who go out and collect the firewood that is going to burn to keep the kiln going. They're going to be the people that create the kiln. They're going to be the people that create the slip for the pots. You're going to be the potter herself. There's going to be there's going to be the pot painters. And so with this whole community of people that are involved, she really didn't want to sign them. Now, ultimately, she's talked into doing so because she realizes that what that will mean is that she can help to add to the economic prosperity of her entire community. And so the impact of this began back in the middle of the 20th century, around the 1950s. The impact of this some 70 years later is that if you go to the Pueblos today, even now, the single greatest source of their income is the sale of ceramic pottery as fine art. And so I love this as an example of the resilience and adaptations of artists whose artistic traditions are important to them, but who find a way, even in the exigencies of the modern world, to translate those artistic traditions into something that still has meaning and value in the modern world. So what I would like you to do in summation is I would like for you, please, to think about and write down, how does this work that we are looking at right here both honor the artistic traditions of the past, of the ancestral Puebloans, at the same time that it adapts to the changes brought about by the modern world?